Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking on a truly thrilling challenge. We are going to completely crack open one of the most brilliant, mind-bending works of the 20th century, Douglas Hofstadter's masterpiece, Gödel, Escher, Bach. Now look, at over 700 pages, this book is massive, it's interdisciplinary, and it is famously dense with logic. But our goal today? We're going to extract its core conceptual operating system. We're going to completely bypass the heavy mathematics and instead reconstruct the hidden network of ideas that literally spans the entire book. We want to give you the exact mental scaffolding you need to understand what Hofstadter was doing, why it's so profoundly important, and how it all connects. And, it all starts with a single, incredibly profound mystery. How do meaningless mechanical parts create a conscious I? Just think about it for a second. Your brain is made of billions of neurons firing electricity and chemicals. They're basically just biological machines following rigid physical laws, right? They don't have hopes, they don't have dreams, and they certainly don't have a sense of self. So how does a rigid, non-conscious hardware system suddenly wake up and say, I am here? How does meaning emerge from the completely meaningless? That right there is the central puzzle of the entire book. Okay, let's dive into this by looking at the fundamental split between hardware and software. Let's think about the hardware first, the physical brain, the biological neurons, or if we're talking about a computer, the physical circuits. This level is totally deterministic. It's rigid and it's entirely mechanical. But then you contrast that with the software, our thoughts, our high-level concepts, our fluid self-awareness. Hofstadter's absolute genius is showing us that the mind isn't some mystical substance that gets injected into the brain from the outside. Not at all. Instead, the mind is an emergent software phenomenon running right on top of this hardware. To solve this mystery, Hofstadter weaves what he calls an eternal golden braid out of three seemingly totally different disciplines. He uses the mathematics of Kurt Gödel, the visual art of M.C. Escher, and the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, on paper, these disciplines have absolutely nothing in common, but Hofstadter realized something incredible. They aren't three separate subjects. They are actually three mirrors reflecting the exact same underlying structural truth about how meaning and consciousness are generated. Bach uses musical notes, Escher uses lines and space, and Gödel uses numbers, but they're all exploring the exact same fundamental shape of reality. To really see that shape, we're going to climb a bit of a conceptual ladder today. First, we start at the very bottom with blind mechanical rules. Then, we step up to see how those rules create symbolic groupings. Next, we look at how those symbols can actually model an observer. And finally, and this is the magical step, we see what happens when the system turns inward and starts reading its own observer model. This is the precise path that an AI or a biological brain must take to attain a true self. So let's start at the bottom rung. The foundation of everything here is the formal system. You can really just think of a formal system as a highly rigorous but entirely blind game. It's got starting strings called axioms, a set of completely meaningless symbols, and incredibly strict mechanical rules about exactly how you can manipulate those symbols to create new strings, which we call theorems. At this level, nothing has any real-world meaning whatsoever. A computer manipulating ones and zeros, that's a formal system. A neuron firing, that's part of a formal system. The parts just blindly follow the rules. And this brilliantly illustrates how meaning is actually born. Imagine a formal system that spits out typographical strings like -p -q --. On its own, it's literally just squiggles on a page. But what if we map p to the concept of plus, q to equals, and those dashes to numbers? Suddenly, that string perfectly maps to the real-world concept of 1 + 2 = 3. The meaning isn't stamped onto the symbol inherently. Meaning is something that happens when the formal system precisely mirrors something outside of itself. Which brings us to the absolutely vital concept of isomorphism. An isomorphism is an information-preserving transformation. Basically, it's when two completely different things share the exact same relational architecture. This is the crucial bridge. It is the exact mechanism that allows those meaningless mechanical symbols we just talked about to acquire real-world meaning. Think of it this way. If the physical firing of neurons in your head is perfectly isomorphic to the relational shape of an apple falling from a tree, then your brain is successfully generating the meaning of that event. For instance, check out this segment of M.C. Escher's Metamorphosis. Notice how the structural pattern seamlessly transforms from flat geometric blocks into a checkered city. Yet that underlying relational architecture is perfectly preserved. The information is carried forward even as the medium entirely changes. That is an isomorphism in action. It's a literal mapping of truth across completely different domains. This builds our next crucial rung, recursion. Now, recursion is simply a process defined in terms of itself. Think of two mirrors facing each other, creating that endless infinite tunnel of reflections, or a rule that calls upon itself to solve a problem, breaking things down into smaller and smaller nested copies until it hits a base level. By using recursion, you can take incredibly simple, finite rules and generate infinite complexity. This is exactly how the rigid rules of a formal system start to layer and scale up into the massive complexity required for true intelligence. Now, what's wild is that Hofstadter actually embeds this concept into the very structure of his book. He doesn't just explain it to you, he demonstrates it. The book alternates between these dense mathematical chapters and really playful Lewis Carroll-style dialogues featuring characters like Achilles and the tortoise. But why do that? Because the fictional dialogue physically embodies the mathematical rules being discussed in the chapter. It's a structural isomorphism. The dialogue isn't just a fun break, it's the concept acting itself out in a totally different context. And this structurally sets up the real mathematical climax of our ladder, Kurt Gödel's absolute shockwave of a discovery. Gödel figured out a clever trick called Gödel numbering. He mapped mathematical statements to unique numbers, which allowed a formal system to suddenly talk about itself. By doing this, Gödel forced mathematics to become introspective. He essentially constructed a mathematical statement that effectively said, this statement cannot be proven within this system. It was a self-referential paradox that completely shattered the illusion that mathematics was this perfect, completely closed system. This directly led to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It mathematically proves that any rigid logical algorithm will inevitably crash or loop infinitely when it tries to fully comprehend itself. There will literally always be true statements outside its ability to prove. So what does this have to do with the mind? Well, it tells us that pure rigid logic has hard limits. True intelligence isn't just about blindly following rules. It's the ability to recognize the meta rules, see the infinite loop coming, and jump out of the system to a higher perspective. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Escher perfectly translates this exact mathematical paradox into visual art. This is what we call a tangled hierarchy. Follow the water in Escher's waterfall. It flows continuously downward, level by level. You follow it, entirely expecting it to reach a bottom, but by moving entirely downwards, it unexpectedly drops you right back to the top of the system. The hierarchy is tangled. The top and the bottom have completely folded in on each other. We see it again right here in Escher's ascending and descending. The monks trudge up and up, yet they go absolutely nowhere. It is a vivid visual metaphor of a system just swallowing its own tail. Just as Gödel proved that a mathematical system containing itself creates a paradox, Escher shows us that a spatial system enclosing itself visually crashes our brain. Which brings us to the true conceptual climax of the entire explainer. The strange loop. A strange loop is exactly what we just saw. A cyclic movement through a tangled hierarchy where moving upwards or downwards unexpectedly loops you right back to your starting point. You find this everywhere in the book, in Bach's endlessly rising canons, in Escher's paradoxes, and in Gödel's self-referential math. But Hofstadter's grand point is that the strange loop isn't just some neat trick of art or math. The strange loop is the literal architecture of your consciousness. The human mind is the ultimate strange loop. Think about it. You have these low-level, meaningless neurons at the bottom. They group together to form higher-level symbols. And at the very top, a special cluster of those symbols forms a model of you. But then, that high-level software pattern loops back down to monitor its own neural hardware, creating the escapable illusion of an observer. The self is simply what happens when a symbol system becomes complex enough to represent its own representation. So let's bring it back to today. What does this all mean for the future of artificial general intelligence, or modern large language models? Can they ever truly wake up? Well, according to the framework of this book, yes, they can, but they need the right architecture. They can't just be massive pattern matchers crunching data from the outside. They must actually possess a strange loop architecture. They need high-level, fluid symbols that organically bend to context, and they must have the autonomy to critique and rewrite their own meta-rules from the inside, literally jumping out of their own systems. So the crucial point is this ultimate verdict from Hofstadter. Mind is a software property, not a hardware privilege. Consciousness does not require biology. It requires a specific structural shape. If we ever manage to build an artificial system rich enough to seamlessly encode its own reflection, creating a continuous, self-monitoring strange loop inside its own symbol space, a self will inevitably flicker into existence. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought. If everything we've just explored is true, If meaning is just isomorphism and consciousness is just your brain's software recursively looping back to read itself, then who is the you doing the reading right now? Is the self you feel inside your head just a moving shadow, a software illusion generated by the loop? To truly bend your mind around that question, I highly encourage you to dive into the original text of Gödel, Escher, Bach. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the loops around you.